turbulence or something. So I'm going to talk about Pat's role in something called structuralism in physics. This is my talk. It's a quote from Pat. The data that Paul Humphreys discussed. Now, philosophers of science will know that the structure of science is the title of Ernst Nagel's book of 1960, which at the time, as an old Columbia student, I was around when Nagel was still alive, and I certainly thought of it that way. And I see as, in Pat's work, a lasting influence, if not a partial isomorphism, of Nagel's particular combination of what he called, or what was called about him, critical naturalism and philosophy of science. And that's despite the fact that Nagel frustrated Pat's desire to write a dissertation on axiomatization of physical theories. Now, I have in mind Nagel's quite skeptical approach toward the then quite prevalent syntactic characterization of theories. Nagel's refusal to engage in grand philosophical pronouncement, his philosophical modesty, as it were, not a word you ordinarily associate with Pat, but and his emphasis, departing in this regard from the Deweyan naturalism to which Nagel was so close otherwise, that formal analysis is an effective tool which should be used wherever possible, particularly in that area of scientific methodology Nagel himself said was characterized by a general fuzziness, the application of theory to empirical subject matter. I shall say more about this in a minute. But for the moment, I only want to observe that the context of this statement, in the context of the statement that we saw, structure of science is used in the Hegelian sense as referring to, quoting Nagel, the logic of scientific inquiry and the logical structure of its intellectual products. Now, the term besetting sin evokes the implacable moral ferocity of an Old Testament prophet. An association perhaps not completely unsuited to Pat's frequent complaints, which we're all familiar with, about the lack of, quote, unquote, any serious discussion in the philosophy of science literature of many issues arising in the methodology of experimentation and testing of scientific theories. Well, but few philosophers of science have risen to Pat's challenge to produce interesting descriptive analyses of actual experiments in science. Paul Humphreys is an exception. A large number have followed his lead in thinking about the formalization or representation of scientific theories. And whether Pat sees himself this way or not, to many philosophers, Pat is the Elijah of structuralism in philosophy of science, proclaiming the language of models while powerfully preaching against the Philistine idolatry of the linguistic or syntactic view of scientific theory. Oversimplified. A recurrent theme in Pat's work and conversation is how very distant, abstract, and inaccurate are most philosophers of science's conception of science and of scientific theories from the practice of science, that is, familiar to the working scientist. In a forceful attempt to rectify this disciplinary shortcoming, Pat somehow managed to publish a paper in 1960 that opens implausibly with several pages of longish quotations from the scientific literature where the term model is employed. Despite the various seemingly quite distinct senses of the term in fields as far apart as economics, psychology, and physics, Pat argued that all these uses could be subsumed under Tarski's sense of model. Moreover, in understated Hegelian fashion, Pat suggested that even radical instrumentalist conceptions of theories must also, quote, yield the ordinary talk about models and theories as first approximation. Here, a model or structure is a non-linguistic object of the appropriate type in which a theory is realized or satisfied. A characterization sufficiently broad enough to encompass both the mathematician's sense of model and the great diversity of uses of the term model in the empirical sciences. In brief, the set theoretic conception is the, quote, basic and fundamental concept of model needed for an exact statement of any branch of empirical science, unquote. And it is more fundamental than the various concepts of model employed in the empirical sciences in the sense that one can use it to give an exact statement of the theory, or use it in exact analysis of the data under investigation. In Pat's conception, a theory is presented by the specification of a set theoretic predicate, essentially an ordered n-tuple of set theoretically defined objects. The theory can then be viewed as the collection of structures picked out by the set theoretic predicate. Now, it would appear that considering theories in the empirical sciences as set theoretic structures is a reflection not only of Tarski's model theory, but also of the significant impact of the Bourbaki mathematics text in the immediate post-World War II period, and influence both pedagogical and broad enough to be considered cultural. Thus, an observation frequently made by Pat, the mathematician's statement of a theory, say the theory of abelian groups, is quite distinct from the syntactic account of an axiomatized theory. This mathematician's sense of axiomatization underlies Pat's well-known papers on axiomatization of classical particle mechanics with McKinsey and Sugar, and relativistic mechanics with Ryckman. A methodological theme of these papers, and in Pat's logic book of 1957, is that formalization of theories under restriction to first-order logic is like boxing with one hand. One might possibly do it, but the result can be neither pretty, nor pleasing, nor efficient. The language of set theory, which can, of course, be given first-order formulation, is required. Now, in the 1950s climate of American philosophy of science, this was something of a heresy. After all, it was only in the 1950s that a passing familiarity with first-order logic became a requirement of the philosophical curriculum. Moreover, there was a widespread perception, prompted, among other influences, by Quine and Goodman's Steps Towards a Constructive Nominalism paper of 1947, which held that responsible philosophers of science must eschew abstract objects of which sets or classes are exemplars. That Quine quickly, but sub rosa, backtracked from nominalism was not generally apparent until much later. Tarski, whose model theory was a principal stimulus to the conception of models of empirical theories that Pat pioneered, certainly also had strong nominalist leanings. But Saul Pfefferman has observed that set theory was, for Tarski, the paradigmatic instrument for purposes of conceptual analysis. Tarski early on submerged any nominalist metaphysical qualms by appeal to something like the pragmatic indispensability argument for the use of classical mathematics in empirical science that we associate with the later Quine. Pat, so far as I can see, has never allowed any metaphysical qualms to impede conceptual analysis. The upshot is that scientific theories are to be presented using mathematics, that is, set theory, not logic. This message to philosophers of science was in any case fully in step with the developing practice of how theories are represented for certain purposes in physics. And I'll just could point to the book of Hawking and Ellis in 1973, The Large-Scale Structure of Spacetime, which is a text on general relativity. Now, to my knowledge, this is the first, if not the first, but it's the most influential, explicit presentation of any modern physical theory in structural form. It initiated what's now called the space-time theories approach. Broadly speaking, space-time theories are presented within the model theoretic framework. Now, the so-called semantic view of theories. Pat is widely cited as an originator, if not the fons et origo of this view. But I think he will exclaim, as did Newton in response to the ascription of a belief in action at a distance, "Pray do not ascribe that notion to me." One readily sees the reason for the attribution by encompassing but generalizing upon the sense of the term model in the empirical sciences under the Tarskian conception. The term semantic view appears altogether natural. But Pat's understanding is not the semantic view, as that view is widely understood. For that idea commonly relies either on the idea of truth-making structure or a truth-making map. In the latter case, models are not non-linguistic objects, for they invoke an interpretation function whose domain is the non-logical vocabulary of a particular language. As for truth-making structure, let's recall the fact that philosophers know, but always seem to forget, that set theoretic relations hold only between mathematical structures, not between structures in something called the world. The idea of truth-making structure, in the realist sense, of a correspondence has no clear meaning. Now, one productive use of the structural views of theories concerns intertheoretic relations, an issue to which Nagel devoted much attention. It's fair to say that some of the best current thinking about reduction of one theory to another, I think of Bob Batterman's work, is not in the Nagelian, but in the structural tradition pioneered by Pat. So in the Suppesian sense, a model of an empirical theory is a mathematical model, a set theoretic structure used to represent a system or kind of system and its behavior. And the theory itself is illuminatingly thought of as a collection of such representative mathematical models. To say then that a representative mathematical model realizes an empirical theory is to say that the model satisfies the description given by the theory's characteristic set theoretic predicate. It fits the description of a certain kind of mathematical structure. And I'm going to follow Pat in a recent paper of 2011 in calling this view the informal structural view, to distinguish it from the semantic view, with its often implicit reference to truth-making structures or maps. So data models. The semantic view commonly is understood to tell us what a scientific theory is. It's just a collection of its models. Pat, on the other hand, has maintained that this is not a definition, I think, but a perspective on theories more in accord with scientific practice. And he's long held that too much philosophy of science is theory talk, as it is as if science were only about theories. And his advocacy of the informal semantic view of theories should be understood in this spirit. His Models of Data paper of 1962 showed us, as Paul has recently reminded us, that if we attempt a precise analysis of the relation between a model of a theory and what Pat called the complete experimental experience, we should have to consider a whole hierarchy of models interposed between that experience and the model of the theory we're attempting to test. Well, anyway, I think Pat has shown us that we can use formal set theoretic tools to display the relations between models in this hierarchy, bringing illumination to an area of scientific methodology that Nagel characterized by a general fuzziness, the application of theory to empirical subject matter. In the past decade and a half, structural approaches to physics among philosophers of physics is a rocketing industry with almost exponential growth. Surely it's a good time to get out of the market. But what the most prolific faction of these folks claim is that physics tells us not about objects of which the world is made, but about the structure of the world in its most extreme form. The claim is that the basic ontology of the world is pure structure. Out with the objects, they're just epiphenomena. The world in and of itself is structure. One can find cosmologists at MIT with this view. This is intended not only as a radical revision of fundamental ontology, but also, in Oxford at least, a necessary component of taking quantum mechanics seriously, quote unquote, the ever or many worlds interpretation. For present purposes, the point is that the originators of the so-called structural realism claim descend from two sources. First, an observation going back to Poincaré and Duhem, and even earlier, that experimental laws are preserved across theory change. This is needed to protect realism from the discontinuities of what Kuhn called paradigm shifts. The second source of structural realism, as they see it, particularly in its virulent ontic version, is the semantic view of theories, that theories are just structures latching on to ontological structure in the world. Pat is widely revered as their ancestor, foreshadowing their claim that everything ultimately is structure. I hope to have made clear in these brief remarks that this idolatry is misplaced, that structural realists are sacrificing their ontological calf at altogether the wrong altar. So I would just like to conclude by saying, Pat, it's been a great experience in my 9 years at Stanford to get to know you. It's been a real pleasure in my life.